Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this lesson is called Using Shapes and Patterns to Define a Fictional Species. So when working on a sci-fi or fantasy project, and you need to create a new species that feels coherent and believable, the first stage I usually go to is to define the species' shape language, patterns, and symbols. From there, so many other design choices just fall into place, and the final results I tend to find hold together a lot better. So this lesson is a discussion of one of my latest environment concepts, and showing how shapes, patterns, and symbols were used to define and strengthen the story and design of the species. So first, a little explanation of the project. I can't give you too many details yet, but a few years ago I was approached by a friend to help with making some images for a project that combines technology and sci-fi with the Baroque. For those who don't know, the Baroque is a style of European architecture, music, and art of the 17th and 18th centuries that is characterized by ornate detail. Here's an example of some. As a fan of the 1984 Dune film aesthetic, and artists like Juan Jimenez, I jumped at the chance to work on the project, and started developing this alien species called the Venrusi. Beyond purely the Baroque, I decided to also incorporate some elements of other art movements, such as Art Deco and a touch of Southeast Asian architecture, places like Thailand and Myanmar. This provided me with a number of design elements. So first, there'd be lots of gold in the architecture. Second, lots of ornate details around edges of things. Number 3, we would have lots of spires, or these little towers. And 4, things would have a very vertical feel to them. So here's the finished architectural concept of a palace for the species. So those design decisions got me started, and now it was time to go deeper. And to get that, I needed the shape language of the species, or what are the most common shapes that will make up the species' architecture, furniture, and even patterns on their clothing. An example I've used before of this sort of design thinking is the dwarves in the Lord of the Rings films. The design motif and shape language for the dwarves were diamonds, triangles, and angular gem shapes. Not only do those shapes represent the gems the dwarves mine from the ground, but it also represented their physical bodies. They were short, wide, stout, and immovable from the ground. And those shapes showed up everywhere in their architecture, their weapons, and other items. So after some thought and some random sketching, I settled on the following shapes that would occur again and again in the Venrusi design aesthetic. So the shapes are the star, the pill, the spindle, the flower, and ribs. Of these 5, I decided the star would be the most prominent. But why? Frequently when creating a species, you'd write a backstory and then find shapes that solidify that backstory. In this case, I hadn't worked out an entire backstory yet, which gave me a chance to allow the art to influence the story. So I decided that while the alien planet has a sun at about the same distance as our own, they also have a neighboring star system that is far closer than our own neighboring star system. And so they have a rather large star in the sky. It shines so brightly it's easily seen during the day and night, and in ancient times the star was worshipped, and so many of the planet's symbology revolves around this star. So it's an example of art solidifying the story, which solidifies the art. The second most important core shape would be the flower, since organic shapes do help sell that Baroque feel. But that choice also helps define the planet. If the planet were a desert planet, or a planet made of jello, then there'd be no reason to see flowers or leaves in the architecture. It wouldn't make any sense. So by including the flower as a core shape, I am basically saying there must also be flowers on the planet. Next came patterns. While I wanted patterns that gave that Baroque feel of intricate detail, what would be the elements that made up that detail? Or another way of saying it, from far it should look like Baroque detailing, but up close that detail could look different than standard Baroque detail. So I decided to stick with some of the plant and flower motifs of human Baroque, but then added to that some patterns based on the star. Also notice the ribs here as well. Ribs are a nice repeating pattern in nature, like the rib cage of an animal, and so that form is a favorite of mine for long repeating patterns. But I avoid the exact same element repeating to infinity, and I'll usually do a repeating pattern, say 3 to 10 times, and then add a different element to break up the pattern a bit. Like a good example of that is right here. So you have a whole bunch of these dots, but then you have some larger shapes here, which then go on to another set which has all the dots again. Next is symbols and logos. These are slightly different from patterns. Patterns are shapes that repeat again and again. These would appear as singles, like say on a flag or a door. Again, I focus mostly on the stars and the flowers. Then I decided the image needed some language for signs and things like that. Since it's an alien species, written English or even something like ancient Roman numerals wouldn't make any sense. so I started building up a character set. I decided to base it on twisty vines. That works with the flower core shape and also helps define the type of vegetation that would exist on the planet. If I pursue this project further, I'll likely take the language and make it into an actual working font. So now back to the environment concept. This was my basic flow. So I came up with the basic story of the species. I then gathered a lot of reference photographs. I then started doing a rough painting of the architecture. And then after I got to a certain point, I stopped and focused on defining the shape language, patterns, and symbols, which I just showed you, based on the reference and the stuff I had already scribbled in the rough painting. Now that I was happy with the shape language, I went back to my painting and started removing any shape language that didn't conform to the rule set I just made, and I started adding more symbols and shapes to the painting that further showed off the shape language. So it wasn't a linear thing, and it rarely is in the early stages of concept. I didn't define a shape language and then paint a painting. I defined some shapes, did some rough painting, refined my shape language, then finished off the painting. For future paintings, I'd basically be done with the inventing portion, and instead I'd stick with the direction that I've already defined. But since this was the first painting, I could have more fun inventing and adapting to come up with a good mixtures of shape and story. And here's the painting again, with red outlines that show the places I used the shape language, patterns, and symbols. So you can see over here we have some ribs going down this part of the architecture, and here are some of those stars. And here are the spindle shapes, and you can see plaques on these various plants have again the star, and then that star pattern again sort of around these big pots. And here you have a pattern, sort of a rib pattern going along the front, and here in this part you can see that there is also some star repeating patterns. And then here's a good example of the written language, and it's in a pill shape. And then another place you see the pill shape are these windows that are back on the main structure. So hopefully this shows you how you can take some key shapes and use them to create a visual language when you want to invent your own alien species. I think following this process will help you create more believable designs, as well as coherent designs, whether it's for film, video game, or even books or role-playing games. So give the technique a try the next time you're exploring a new sci-fi or fantasy world. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. And if you want more tutorials like this, please go to neilblevins.com and go to the art lessons section. Or if you want to be notified the next time I post a new video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.